a little bit of background, and it's certainly not because I'm anything special, but maybe it will place into context why I've fallen in love with the written and spoken word through the years. When I was a kid, and this is way back, I was born in the first half of the last century, so let that distill for just a moment. When I was a kid growing up, TV didn't proliferate, particularly TV sports, and every kid in the state of West Virginia wanted to be Jerry West. Jerry West is now the logo of the NBA. They called him Zeke from Cabin Creek. He was from just up the road in Cabin Creek, West Virginia. And he went to WVU in the late 1950s and took us to the cusp of the national championship game his junior year. Later went on to play at a tremendous level for the Los Angeles Lakers and was enshrined in the NBA Hall of Fame. He became an NBA front office guy and so on and so forth. But when I was a kid, because we couldn't watch West on TV, we had to listen to the radio accounts of Jerry West. And that evoked in the mind of a 9 or 10-year-old basketball wannabe the idea of vicariously living through West and appreciating the ability of someone who could wordsmith, verbally creating that theater of the mind picture of Jerry West and some of the cool things that he was able to do on the court. So pretty soon I realized that I was not going to be the next Jerry West. I was slow and I ran in one place for too long and so forth, but I thought maybe I could stay close to the craft of trying to relay to other people what's going on the court. And as games would progress, when I got into college at West Virginia University, I was a journalism major, and I can remember one of the things that I enjoyed the most was on Friday afternoons, that was when they just began jiffing, TGIF. So we'd go to the College Inn in Morgantown, which was run by a guy that had been an NFL referee, and pound down a couple of Iron City beers because they were 59 cents a quart in those days. And then go back and I would tune in 3WE, which was a station in Cleveland, and they had a wonderful broadcaster named Joe Tate. And Tate's ability to both be rhythmical and reflect the pace of the game and do it in telegrammatic phrases is something that I just fell in love with and began to try to utilize that in other areas. So graduated with a journalism major, news ed, and I stopped on my way back home at the TV radio station on Cumberland Road. It's where off Cumberland Road, where BVA is right now. That time it was WHIS TV. And on the way home, I stopped and asked for a job. I'd worked as an intern one summer, and they gave me a job. Didn't pay me anything. We all knew we weren't stars, and every 2 weeks our paychecks proved that fact at the station. So we all had to moonlight. And I did TV and did some radio and had a chance to continue to broadcast ball games, and it was kind of fun, but I was very poor. So I had very thick glasses at the time, Coke bottle thick glasses, and I knew that my time on TV was going to be very short-lived if I continued to be on the air and had something that was akin to a magnifying glass thickness glasses. So I went to a local eye doctor, and he looked at my dilemma and he said, I think we can fit you for contact lenses. And my biggest question was, how in the world am I going to pay for them? So he, knowing the fact that I had to make a nickel travel so far, the buffalo got sore feet. Now you got to be old before you appreciate the buffalo head nickel analogy there. But he said, read this article, and it was an article about synthetic absorbable sutures in cataract surgery. And he said, I did the best that I could to try to dumb it down to a way that I could understand it, not understanding the technical jargon. But at the end of it, he came back in the room and he said, tell me what you think it said. And I tried to, in very layman terms, explain what I thought the article said. And he said, well, how would you like to work this off, just by working a few hours, creating a more layman approach to some technically oriented articles? He said, I'm doing surgery and research in vitro or in actual living things of a synthetic absorbable suture called a Vicryl and another one called Dexon in cataract surgery. And in those days, they didn't have an intraocular lens. You had to open the area of the eye, right where the iris or the colored part of the eye meets the sclera, or the white part, and make a half-lap incision and pull that cataractus lens out, and then suture the eye, and the eye would be very angry post-op, and lots of reaction if you use catgut or collagen, because they were proteinaceous sutures, and the body reacted to that. If you used an inert suture like steel, the wound would never heal, because they found out later that it took a little bit of reaction to bring the blood flow and the collagen to bind the two edges of the wound to begin to sort of cohese them or bring them back together. So he's developing all this with these micro sizes of Vicryl and Dexon, and was doing some things, no pun intended, that were pretty cutting edge at the time. And I had a blast because he continued to keep me on during that period of time, and I'd meet between the 6 o'clock and 11 o'clock news, and he'd debrief himself on these sutures' performance, and then we would draft articles that he would present both to layman organizations and also to professional organizations, and talk about these micro sizes of suture and how they performed intraoperatively and postoperatively in cataract surgery. And I thought, this is a pretty neat gig for a guy who's just an old sports writer, sports caster. Maybe there's a little bit of a future in this. So I was able kind of to continue to do that. And then the Daily Telegraph needed somebody to write articles. And so I began to broadcast for Bluefield State. And in the 70s, Bluefield State had an amazing team. We won 31 games one year in the conference overall, set a record, and we represented the entire West Virginia Intercollegiate Athletic Conference in a tour of Europe one year. Fairmont had a 7-year home court win streak, and we broke their home court winning streak during that period of time. We had no dorms, so all of our kids were like 6'5", 175, 6'6", 185, and they had to play a brand of ball that kept the other team that had the dormitory housed, cornbread, big, strong, physical post players from being able to play half court. So it was really lightning pace of basketball, up and down. Fun as the dickens to be a broadcaster and try to broadcast that. And I got to do that, but I also got a love for Bluefield State during that period of time. So I continued to work for Dr. Blades and do these games at Bluefield State. And I realized there's a tremendous amount of history and heritage and culture and just wonderful stories that this region is steeped upon, and began to catalog those. And if I've been blessed with anything, it's that I got a decent memory. And for some reason, those thoughts collate into the topic that we discuss. And in most cases, you don't have to talk too long to find something of a national scale that comes back to a local application. Something that happened here that was the catalyst or the springboard for it, or something that was derived from something national that came back locally. So as I continued to write for Dr. Blades, he wanted to retire. And his son had taken over the practice. So now you've got this Coalfield ophthalmological practice that began in the 1920s that had gone on at that time until, say, 1980 or so. And he's getting ready to hang it up. Can you write a book about some of the really cool things that we have done? His father found out in the 1930s that the West Virginia School for the Blind in Romney, he went up and examined the students, and he said, you got a bunch of kids that have congenital cataracts. They've had cataracts from birth. So he said, he, Dr. Blades Sr., Elliot's dad, believed that he could do cataract surgery and restore vision to these kids. And so he partnered with the Lions clubs in the Eastern Panhandle in Romney and in Bluefield. And on a train, with Lions being the chaperones, they came down to what's now the Maples. It was then St. Luke's Hospital, and turned the top floor into a pediatric ward. And he did cataract surgery and restored vision to 32 of those kids. So when I was writing this book right here, the book on Dr. Blades, Bringing It Home, I interviewed the guy who was the son of the headmaster of that school. And he said, you don't realize what a life changer that was, because in the 30s, if you had an individual who was differently able, the parents thought that it was in some fashion God's disfavor upon them, that he didn't bless them, and as a result, the curse was to have this child, and they tried to keep the child sheltered and somewhat out of the public eye. And these children lived a very limited existence and not a very fulfilling existence. So with cataract surgery and sight restoration, their entire lives changed. And the Lions Club International, Dr. Blade's got a proclamation from the King of Siam, which is, I guess, modern-day Iran? Iraq? Thailand? Okay. The King of Siam, who sent a letter saluting what they'd done in Bluefield, West Virginia, with the Blades folks. And the children, of course, went on to do some great things. And the history of the region began to become kind of neat and cool for me. And worked at the radio station, and I was a sales manager at Kicks Country and J104 and that whole conglomerate for about 12 years and continued broadcasting. Well, I got married, and we had kids, and kids cost. And I still didn't make enough money. So an opportunity arose to come over to Bluefield State, and I did that in 1991. And worked for 25 years for 4 different full-time presidents and 4 different interim presidents, and learned a lot of cool stuff about Bluefield State. And ended up being the ghostwriter for this book, which was the Centennial History of Bluefield State, that was published in 1995. And I began to kind of derive some things through that. I've come back after I've retired, and I thought I'd take, first of all, Dr. Zucconi, how long do I have? I don't want to...
10:45.
Okay. Well, I'll throw some things out, and I don't want to belabor you with... fast talking is like fine print. You don't hear one, you don't read the other. So I'll try to slow it down from a broadcaster's pace to just kind of share some things that I've found throughout the years. And this may have real meaning for you because you're already practicing the craft at a newspaper. Dr. Zucconi asked me to talk about both writing popular and specialized audience articles. When I began working at the TV station and stringing at the newspaper, the popular style of news story writing was the inverted pyramid. And that's one where you understand that the man in the days where he took his coffee and his hard copy newspaper and would stain his fingers with the ink on the print. He'd have his coffee in the morning, we didn't have time to read deeply into the article. So it was important to tell as much of the story as you could in the first paragraph before the individual, and if the individual wanted to find out more about it, they could dig into it and read more deeply. And that's kind of evolved now. That's not always an ironclad rule. Sometimes now you can find an individual who puts a face on a situation, like the government shutdown. And what does it mean to an individual who's always been very self-sufficient and proud, and now they have to line up at a soup kitchen because their income flow has been interrupted. And if you can find that one story, that tells it in a much more eloquent fashion than you can when you talk about X 100,000 government workers are without work. It humanizes and puts a face on it. So you could lead with something like that in some cases, and we've seen that in many cases around this region with the decline of the coal market and the impact on communities like Wyoming County with the closure of a major coal mine. What's that going to mean in terms of the trickle-down effect, fewer tax dollars, and what will occur there? We've seen some things in McDowell County, for example. McDowell County has been sort of the whipping child of the state and sometimes the nation, who demean McDowell County because of its declining economy without an appreciation of the human resilience that exists in McDowell County. And when Anthony Bourdain visited, in the last actual Parts Unknown show that he did was in McDowell County, and it was sort of a tribute to the tough-minded optimism through some really tough times of the folks in McDowell County. I always found that in life, individuals who never experience adversity are pretty shallow. Individuals who do experience adversity and don't embrace the adversity but embrace the lesson that's involved in weathering that adversity through prayer and through a variety of different endeavors, those individuals tend to come out on the other side a lot stronger and better prepared for life than the individual who's never tasted that. And McDowell County is full of stories exactly like that. So that's another way you can take that traditional inverted pyramid. The thing that I would say, if you're thinking about writing popular or specialized articles, you want to consider the audience that you're focused upon reaching. Because in many cases, in an article about suture performance, if you talk about catgut is derived from the serosal layer of sheep intestine and collagen, or the submucosal layer of beef intestine, and it affects the absorption rates of those two sutures. Most people don't care about that. They do care that it's making my eye very violently reactive, and I need something that will allow my wound to heal, but not incite the same level of reaction, just a very small and predictable amount of reaction. So you try to shake some of the technical starch out of it for a layman audience. If you're writing for a specialized audience, that's in their wheelhouse. They want to know those types of details. So you consider that audience. Then you try to develop some level of comfort with the article. You don't have to be a subject matter expert in the article at the outset, but you want to at least do due diligence. Take a Google dumpster dive into what you can find out about that, so that your questions are driven by some level of knowledge, and also driven by a legitimate hunger to find out a little bit more about that topic. Think about what you yourself want to find out about it. Think about, if you're writing for a particular audience, what they would like to find out about it. If you're writing for an audience that's particularly coal country driven, what opportunities might exist in new industries that would replace a declining coal market? What repurposing of coal for technologies that can burn coal more cleanly can provide for an element of hope, and where are those things? So a lot of times, just by considering the audience that you want to reach, you can craft some of the questions that, and you'd be Joe or Susan, every person, in asking those type of questions, because the audience that reads that will in many cases want to know. I was at a governmental meeting not long ago where some of the comments that were made in this public meeting disparaged folks in Matoka, in McDowell County, all local contractors, and a variety of other groups. But the article that was ultimately reported about that ignored those comments. And to me, sometimes you've got to, as you think about your questions, at least be able to multitask enough so that you keep in your mind the ability to listen acutely to what that person is saying, so that if there is a red flag, you can pump the brakes of what your next question would be and go back to that type of question. So for a general audience, making the technical or the specialized make sense at an understandable non-layman level is pretty important. And we talked about the synthetic absorbable sutures in micro size as one of the examples of that. The other one that has to do with preparation for writing, and that's the interview. I learned when I was a sales manager and a salesman prior to that the individual asking the questions is in charge. The individual who's doing the majority of the talking without asking the questions is the one who's vulnerable to the question that would challenge some of the truths that they're putting out there. So in prepping, what I try to do is make a list of questions, but be acutely aware of the need to know what my next question in queue is, but at the same time, keep it right there as kind of Linus's safety blanket in the days of the old Charlie Brown. And at the same time, know that you're honing in with laser focus on what this person is asking. Don't let the interviewer, if the subject is a hot topic, divert. And here's a strategy for diversion. I might ask Dr. Lewis a question about something academic, and his response, and this is classic. If you hear someone say to you, "That's a great question," the bell should be ringing at that point, because instead of feeling satisfied, sassy, and sensational that they recognize that I've got the mental prowess to ask a great question, what they're trying to do is subtly divert from answering that question. And what will happen oftentimes, if I say that, Dr. Lewis says, "That's a great question," his next rejoinder to me is, to answer that question, we really need to consider this. And all of a sudden, my GPS has gone wacko, and I'm on another road without realizing it, and hearing what he wants to tell me to embellish the story or to develop it, than what I really wanted to get. So don't be afraid to go back to that. Thank you very much for that perspective. But again, it brings us back to the point of what, and you ask the question a second time. And most of the time, when you revert to it in a non-confrontational way, the individual will go ahead and take a stab at trying to answer the question. Don't be afraid of silence in the interview. Sometimes that subject will throw out an answer to you in preparation for writing a story, either specialized or general in nature. And then if you pause, they tend to, in many cases, be uncomfortable with the pause, thinking, I must not have fully answered that. So they'll provide more detail that you wouldn't have gotten if you went directly to your next question in the process. One great catch-all question. It's not what you can do many times to get a response from somebody who's been very guarded. They have both hands on their wallet. They're keeping their eye on the clock when you're asking the questions. Is, you close your notebook, you put your pen down, and you begin to get up to leave. And as you're walking out, and you can almost sense the palpable relaxation that the other person has. As you get to the door, let me ask you one other thing. Just happen to think about this. You really didn't. You can then ask them that question where, with their blinders off, relaxation occurring, you might get a little bit better answer. And before you get up to leave, a terrific question to ask in the interview process is, let me ask you this. If you were me asking the questions, what would you ask that I haven't already asked? That way, if a person has something they want to say, but I haven't elicited it by my questioning, it gives them their at-bat. And if there's nothing that they say there, well, let me ask you this. You understand basically what I've asked in the process. Is there anything else that you'd like to say that I haven't given you a chance to say by my questioning? Well, the real story, I think, behind all of this, and they go on with that, and all of a sudden, you've got something that's a very tangible basis for going ahead and developing your story. On a hotly debated topic, as we said, don't let the person dodge that question. Go ahead.
The strategy you just explained, where you're getting them, like you have that afterthought, so-called, and ask them to ask you the question that you hadn't asked, and then they start, as you said, they give you this tangible material. Do you at that point need to ask them their permission to use that information, or is that something that because they've already volunteered it, it's yours to use?
I can answer that this way, and I'm not trying to dodge your question.
No.
Okay.
That's fine.
When I go in on the interview, if they understand that I'm preparing the story, I want them to understand that as the condition stands when we launch the interview, this is on the record. If they ask to go off the record, there really needs to be a very, very good reason for that. If you do agree to go off the record, you sabotage the potential for a good story if information that they're sharing with you off the record would come from somebody else on the record, because then, unless you could source it to that other person, you violated the trust of the first person. And if they're a newsmaker, you can't go back to them because you've ruptured that trust. There's a saying that what has the juggler to offer our king but his skill? What has the journalist to offer their subject but street cred? What credibility do I bring in the process of doing all this? So you've got to be very careful about that. And it's very rare that I'll go off record on anything at Bluefield State. I can probably name, we had a device, we had a series of bomb threats in the early 1990s here. And there was a device found in the men's room on the ground floor of the Basic Science Building. And there was a digital wristwatch with wires attached to it to a gas can from Advanced Auto Parts. So the campus was evacuated. The state demolitions experts, explosive demolitions experts, were choppered in, and they landed in the pit, and they came up, and they had a guy that was a specialist in this. And I had media holding them at bay up on the faculty row, the housing on the left as you drive into campus. And I can remember these folks had on a pole, almost like Travis, I guess the priests would bear the Ark of the Covenant, and doing that. And they brought it down to the pit and had a controlled detonation at that time, where they couldn't determine whether it was explosive or not, but they wanted to see if the contents were something that was flammable or a very volatile substance. And they put it in something akin to a casket and exploded it. And that way they were able to contain whatever contents were inside that gas and analyze it, and it was just water. So I talked to a gentleman named Rick Robertson, who was the public spokesperson for the state police. And my goal was to give people some element of at least relief in the note, to say it was just water in the gas can as analyzed by the state police demo experts and their forensics folks. So it was not a real threat, though the concern level was off the meter at that time. And he said, don't do it. I said, why? And he said, well, the profile of an individual who does something like this is that if you show that there were no teeth in their first threat, they'll try to do it again, this time put teeth in it, and make it a more dangerous threat. So I had to suppress information that I knew at that time for the greater good of the likely greater safety, as long as this individual was at large, and had to suppress that piece of information. It was a very difficult ask, but in situations that involve safety, I think sometimes you can make a case for that. I don't know if that fully answers your question, but I think it does to some extent. And recognize, as a reporter, as a writer, some of your stories are either cyclical, they happen periodically over a period of time, or they're evolving. One example, many of you who are local have seen from the summer of 2018, late spring, early summer, the controversy over Mitchell Stadium. It had three tenants: Bluefield College, Tazewell County Public Schools, Mercer County Public Schools, and all were paying $50,000 a year for stadium rent. And Tazewell County Schools was upset in part because the stadium, as you go to it, is all tricked out with Bluefield decals in the end zones, and Bluefield, if both teams have a game on a Friday night, gets Friday nights, and Grand gets games on Saturday. And the town of Bluefield, Virginia, despite the fact that they were in some financial crisis in terms of town budget and contemplating laying some folks off, was also contemplating building a 6,000-seat stadium in Bluefield, Virginia. And so, because that story evolved in the fashion that it did, there were updates periodically. There was discussion about building a field in Springville so that it could house games from a variety of different schools. It was an imperfect solution because at the Beaver Graham game, where you draw 10,000, if it was a 6,000-seat facility, in addition to the fiscal note of going into debt, you're going to disenfranchise 4,000 people and lose 4,000 ticket sale revenue for the Beaver Graham game. And if a Graham Tazewell game was there, you'd lose revenue there because Tazewell travels well, and Richlands travels well, and Gate City travels well. And there were just, in addition to the inconveniences that occurred. So there was a variety of things there. The first story was the controversy. The second story, and the story that I was hoping would take flight at that time, was to talk about the background behind the building of the stadium. In 1922, the town of what's now Bluefield, Virginia, was known as Graham, Virginia. And there was a symbolic marriage. I think it was a young lady from Bluefield, Virginia, married a young man from Bluefield, West Virginia, or vice versa, but you had a couple from across the state line. And there was an initiative to rename Graham, Virginia, Bluefield, Virginia. And so at City Park, with a great big tent, one of the revival-sized tents that they had a marriage. And town leaders were there, and it was a wonderful thing. Shortly after that, the Great Depression. And as one of the work creation projects, I think it was a works project administration project, to create income for people, not unlike in the state of West Virginia, the roads project that was launched by Bonds this year by Governor Justice, to put folks back to work, give them disposable income, and then fuel the economy of the region by supporting the support businesses that are created. Mitchell Stadium was created, 10,000-seat stadium, well ahead of its time in terms of its structure, and it's been sort of timeless. It's a venerable cradle of football greatness. And then talk about some of the great players that have been there. Bully Bill Dudley, who played ball for Graham in the late 1930s, Later went to the University of Virginia and ended up being an All-American player, went to the pros, and in 1 year in the pros in the 1940s with either the Pittsburgh Steelers or the Washington Redskins, I forget which team, he led the National Football League in rushing, and that's carrying the ball, yardage carry. He led it in scoring because he was a drop kicker. He didn't have a holder. He just dropped the football and kicked extra points and field goals. And in interceptions, because in those days you played both ways, offensively and defensively. Now they make a big deal about a guy who's on offense who doubles up and plays 1 or 2 downs on defense. But that guy's first